Welcome to Natu Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. The Marxist Theory of Art by A.V. Lunacharsky. Art and Life. What is life? What is a living organism? An organism is a complex aggregate of solid and liquid bodies, possessing heterogeneous physical and chemical properties and being in consistent mutual dependence. The various functions of this aggregate are coordinated among themselves and with the environment in such a way that the organism remains itself, that is, does not lose its formal unity. As long as an organism preserves its form more or less unchanged, although it constantly changes all elements of its body, as long as it has this ability of self-preservation, ability to restore mobile equilibrium when it is disturbed by influences of the environment, until then we call it living. A dead organism passively submits to mechanical, thermal, chemical, and other influences of an environment and disintegrates into compound elements. Thus, life is the capacity for self-preservation, or, more precisely, the very process of self-preservation of organisms. We consider an organism the more perfect or vital, the greater its capacity for self-preservation. If we would observe an organism in more or less constant environment, we would find that a certain balance is established between it and this environment, that the organism gradually develops a number of the most expedient reactions to influence of environment. At every key change of environment for the organism, it either dies or changes itself, develops new reactions, which is reflected also in its structure. Changes in the structure of the organism under the influence of external influences in the process of adaptation to the environment can be called evolution. Under relatively unchanging conditions, an organism is produced which is relatively ideal for the given environment, i.e., most capable of surviving under given conditions. Such an organism has one huge disadvantage. The more certain of its organs are adapted to certain functions, the more helpless it will be when the conditions change. A new impact can immediately put at stake the very existence of a conservative organism. Since in nature an invariable or uniformly changing environment is far from representing the general rule, the organism, in order to live, cannot counteract nature with the same cycle of reactions, but must vary them according to the peculiarities of external influences. Therefore, the most vital, ideally perfect organism would be one which would have a variety of reactions sufficient to sustain life under all conditions. The varying environment is thus a kind of condition which educates the organism. Out of a number of reactions brought to life by the environment, a rich arsenal of different techniques of self-defense, attack, etc., is eventually developed through selection and direct adaptation. The organism becomes more and more resourceful in the fight against the environment, as resourcefulness and adaptability are only two different expressions for the same property of highly developed organisms. It is clear from this that the more variable the environment in which the organism lives, the more reactions it must develop in the process of adaptation, the more resourceful it will be in all kinds of dangers, since resourcefulness or adaptability is the result of experience. The ideal organism will be the one whose experience encompasses all things, all possible influences of the environment, and whose resourcefulness overcomes every obstacle to its life or existence. We can call any evolution that removes the organism from the development of new, complex, changeable reactions regressive. We can call any evolution that leads to the enrichment of the organism with a more and more complex apparatus of expedient reactions progressive. Regression can be useful for the preservation of a given individual. Progress can sometimes be harmful. Indeed, if a complex organism enters an environment where most of its organs are not needed, they may prove directly detrimental to it. But by and large, progressive evolution leads to the strengthening of life in nature, and we can see the crown of such evolution in man. If we imagine an organism at rest, in perfect harmony with its environment, we will have before us a certain stable process, a certain mobile equilibrium. Any deviation from this equilibrium we call vitalism. Vitalism is a deviation from the usual regular course of life caused directly by unusual influence of environment or any internal processes, in the end, also as an indirect result of such influence of environment. The setting of any kind of lifespan to a greater or lesser extent exposes life to limitation and risk. As we know from experience, the organism experiences in its psyche the influence of the external environment as sensations, and most of its reactions are responses to sensations, with the purpose of terminating them or intensifying them, holding them back. It is natural to expect that the organism has developed adaptations tending to retain, prolong those very processes that are beneficial to life, and to terminate, as far as strength is concerned, those that are harmful. The mental expression of these adaptations are the sensations of pain and pleasure. If an external irritation causes a fluctuation of life, threatens the equilibrium of the body, it is experienced as pain, suffering, unpleasantness. Also, some destructive processes in the organism itself, an indirect result of external influences, can be experienced as illness, as something severe. On the contrary, external influences that restore the disturbed balance, and any reactions tending to the same, are perceived as pleasant. We will call this negative or positive coloring, in which the organism sees its sensations, due to external or internal conditions, as positive, or relationally, negatively effective. Thus, we can say everything that directly promotes life is accompanied by an immediate positive affect. Everything that hinders it is accompanied by a negative affect. The affect is nothing other than the reflection in the psyche of the present increase or decrease of life in the whole organism, or in a particular part of it. It is clear by itself that there are sufferings, i.e., lowerings of vitality, useful, sometimes necessary for saving life, as some painful operations, for example, and on the contrary, pleasures, i.e., increases of life, harmful, i.e., paid later by much greater lowering of it as a direct result of such a pleasure. But the immediate affect, as a primitive adjustment, does not consider the remote results of processes. This is a case of seeing reason, though, of course, the affective coloring may change over time. We cannot say whether any affect is accompanied by perfect equilibrium, since not all can be observed. We can assume, however, that an absolutely undisturbed life equilibrium, like a dream without dreams, is not perceived at all. Everything that we perceive as life, both in ourselves and in other organisms, is an imbalance, and the result of such imbalances. From this, it may be deduced that suffering is something original, namely, a disturbance of equilibrium, while pleasure is something derivative, which can take place only when the disturbed equilibrium is restored, that is, only as the cessation of suffering. Such a conclusion, however, would be completely wrong. The fact is that the interaction of the organism and the environment is twofold. On the one hand, the environment destroys the organism, exposes it to all kinds of dangers, and the organism, through various kinds of reactions, protects itself from it. On the other hand, it also gives the organism conditions for its restoration and conservation. It is not only the environment of irritations, but also the environment of nutrition. The organism is constantly forced to dissipate energy for the sake of self-defense or self-assertion, and this energy must constantly be restored, flowing to all the organs of the body in the necessary quantity. Each organ is a certain reserve of special potential energy, which, under the influence of the environment, it brings into action. The reserve must be restored. If the waste of energy is so great that commensurate restoration is impossible, or if the inflow of energy in the form of nutrients is so negligible that it's unable to cover the ordinary expenditure, the organ is exhausted, the equilibrium is broken, a negative affect occurs. But, of course, it is also possible to upset the balance in the other direction. If a given organ, which represents, we repeat, a certain amount of organized potential energy, for a long time is not exercised, then the inflow of nutrition to it is absolutely unnecessary. It is not converted into necessary specific energy, i.e., it is not organized, but deposited in the form of fat, etc. Eventually, the organ is reborn or atrophied, because not only does the inflow of nutrition gradually cease, but the tissues of the unexercised organ itself are recycled by the organism. Disturbances of equilibrium towards an excess of nourishment are at first not at all experienced as severe. Only in the long absence of exercise does the organ seemingly begin to demand exercise. A severe feeling appears, causing, for example, the standing horses to trample and tear, or causing an urgent need for prayer after unmoving work in man. The negative affect that accompanies overexercise is less sorrowful and less vivid than the one accompanying overexercise, which is understandable. Such a disturbance of equilibrium does not threaten the body with immediate misfortune. Nevertheless, the rapid discharge of energy in an organ that has not been exercised for a long time is experienced as pleasure. If stagnation in metabolism does not give a feeling of suffering, then acceleration of metabolism, as long as it does not turn into fatigue, that is, as long as the inflow of nutrition is sufficient to cover expenditure, is experienced as pleasure. If the recovery of overconsumed energy is accompanied by a positive affect, so is the expenditure of overconsumed food. At a certain stage of overconsumption of nutrition, one already feels something like a deft need to move, to expend energy. The first moments of expenditure give such pleasure that the organism willingly surrenders to it, even aimlessly. Such aimless expenditure of overconsumed nutrition, its quick transformation into specific energy of different organs, and its dispersion we call games. The positive affect that accompanies the organism's play is of great biological importance. It contributes to the preservation of the organs and ensures progressive evolution. This will become quite clear when we consider evolution itself in terms of the dual vitalities we have established. If an organism has been exposed to some new influence of environment, or forced to increase some of its function, to perform work, far beyond the usual limits, then, of course, we have before us the vital rates of energy overuse, which must be eliminated. It is quite clear, however, that it can be eliminated in two ways. The work turns out to be excessive. To eliminate this disharmony, it is possible either to reduce the work itself, or to increase the inflow of energy in the form of nutrition. Very often, both ways are equally possible for the organism. Plastic, to develop a new complex reaction to increase its strength, or to replace one kind of reaction with another, less habitual but more economical one. Or passive, simply to refuse work, retreat, avoid, endure, shrink. Vitalities are eliminated either actively, by developing new adaptations that increase the total amount of energy of the whole organism, or a given organ, or provide for a given organ the help of others, etc., or passively, by fleeing from a new task. Active solution of vital functions leads to differentiation of the organism, increases its experience, resourcefulness, general vitality, while passive solution, at best, leaves the organism in the same position, often reduces the area of its life, leads to partial death, to atrophy of some needs, etc. Let us explain by example. Let us suppose that some race of people or breed of animals invades an area previously occupied by another race or breed. Life becomes hard, all conditions change, whether the aliens directly attack the natives or, by competing with them, make food and other sources of life less available. The Aborigines can resist, whether by fighting the new enemy directly, or by developing the most expedient methods of such a fight, or by perfecting those organs and implements which are aimed at obtaining all the necessities of life. But they may also submit to fate, preferring peace and a meager existence to the exertion of their strength. They may move out of the country, fleeing farther and farther to inhospitable countries, take the subordinate position of vassals, if people are involved, They may get used to less nutrients, to less food, and correspondingly decrease in growth, etc. In the first case, in the case of active resistance or competition by improvement, the invasion of a new enemy will prove highly beneficial to the race or breed, developing courage, agility, flair, intelligence, etc. In the second, it will lower the natives by several rungs in the ladder of life. The active man of the West, at every pain, trouble, distress, tries to find their causes and cure them by a decisive measure. The passive man of the East stupefies himself with drugs or even is simply transfixed by resignation. The first eliminates vitality realistically, the second, as if closing his eyes to everything, helps himself to ignore it, narrowing the field of consciousness. The result is obvious. The tendency to resolve life actively or passively is determined by very complex reasons, which we cannot go into here. We observe the same for another kind of vital signs. Let us assume that the organism receives an excess of nutrition, that under given favorable conditions, it does not need to spend all this amount of nutrition, and that this threatens the organism with an excessive accumulation of extraneous, disorganized substances, e.g., fatty tissues. A passive solution to this kind of life-threatening problem would be to reduce the amount of nutrition accordingly. With such a solution, the total amount of energy represented by the organism will decrease, the unexercised organs will begin to atrophy, they will require less and less nourishment, and the inflow of forces from the environment, due to stagnation in the activity of the organism, will approach a minimum. Such an organism, of course, will inevitably die if the favorable time passes and hard times come again, and the former adaptations are already lost. The active resolution of the vitality of the kind in question would be play. That is, the aimless waste of excess energy, enabling the organs to function with all their fullness, and thus not only to persist, but even to intensify. In fact, the work of the organs, or their labor, which is oriented towards practical goals, must be subordinated to different necessities, being more or less incorrect depending on the conditions. It is known, for example, that all labor strives for rhythm, but often meets in this striving insurmountable obstacles. In play, the organs manifest themselves with complete freedom, that is, as for them most naturally, in the greatest accordance with the whole structure. Hence the special pleasure of play, the feeling of freedom which distinguishes it. In the play of the organism lives a most correct life. It spends energy to the extent necessary, and in this way it gives the greatest pleasure, obeying only itself, that is, its organization. The playing animal is the exercising animal. Now, it is clear why we have said that play is the provision of progressive evolution. An animal which resolves life difficulties of all genera actively evolves towards an ideal organism. For every change in the environment, it develops a new function. For every surplus expenditure, it seeks to find new sources of strength. For every surplus of strength, practically useful and systematic work. In view of the undoubted advantages that, in the struggle for existence, active organisms have over passive ones, progressive over merely adaptive, it can be assumed, though it can hardly be stated with certainty, that the very growth of forces, the very progress of life, is accompanied by a positive affect. That is, that all organisms have a thirst for power, a thirst for the growth of life. As far as the progressive type of people in particular is concerned, this need for progress as such already becomes unquestionable. But this is not enough. We have yet another peculiarity of life to consider, that is, the resolution of life differences, which is of the utmost importance. We speak of the principle of the least expenditure of strength. The strength of the organism is limited. In its struggle with nature, the organism must be calculating. While consciousness is still in its infancy, this prudence is established by selection, that is, by the survival of those organisms which have had sufficient strength to survive and multiply, and by the outright destruction of those organisms which have exhausted themselves. Not to be exhausted in the struggle, to live only on income, not on basic capital, is the task that spontaneously arose in the struggle for existence. Since the psyche is a certain adaptation in this struggle and consists in the ability of individuals to recall, that is, to find similarities and differences of conditions and to regulate their reactions accordingly, it is natural that the psyche has been subjected to the same law. On the lower stages of development, organisms are guided not by considerations, but by sensations, or, more exactly, by affective characteristics accompanying sensations. Every external stimulus and every organism's own act acquires positive or negative affective coloring, which, as a matter of fact, can be viewed as a rudiment of syllogism. Some subjective or objective phenomenon, A, is felt, it is unpleasant. The organism tries to stop it. Another phenomenon, B, is felt, it is pleasant, the organism tries to prolong it. At higher stages of development, in man, for instance, direct pain and pleasure no longer play that exclusive role, and beside the biological, I must therefore strive to suppress it, etc. Since all vain dissipation of energy is unconditionally harmful to the organism, we have a right to expect that irrational expenditure of it will be accompanied by negative affectivity, and especially rational expenditure by positive affectivity. We call a rationally directed force the force that achieves the greatest possible effect, or vice versa. We consider the effect achieved the more rationally, the less energy is expended to achieve it. It is known that at any work a part of energy is dissipated unproductively for side results. Every organ is a kind of machine, adapted to a certain mechanical or chemical action. It functions in a certain way. It has the ability to restore the energy expended. If we feel uncomfortable working with our hands, it means that our movements are not free, that in order to achieve the goal, we have to expend a considerable part of our energy for nothing. The negative affect, which consists in feeling uncomfortable, is an expression of the unproductive dissipation of energy. The free, pleasant work of the ear, eye, hand, or foot is the work to which the organ is best adapted, which makes it possible for it to achieve its necessary result for the organism with the least expenditure of energy. We know that overwork in general is unpleasant, but we cannot claim that in all cases of unpleasant sound, flickering in the eyes, etc., phenomena overwork immediately occurs. Obviously, in the organs, there is a special meter, so to speak, of the relative expenditure of effort. Self-regulating machines actuate the regulator not when the excessive rapidity of work has already caused an overuse of force, but when an abnormal course of work has hardly begun. We notice the same in the organs. A certain work is done, it is accompanied by pain or a feeling of discomfort. It stops. There's not yet an overspill, but it would occur if the work continued. It is as if the organ lets it know at once that this kind of work, à la longue, is beyond its capacity. In a word, the work is evaluated not by the absolute, but by the relative expenditure of energy. Here the difficulty immediately strikes the eye, which the first creators of the theory of vitality had already outlined. What is called a relatively excessive expenditure of energy? The theory of vital functions establishes a certain relation only between the inflow of energy and its expenditure. But here it is not, at first sight, about this relation. There are hard works which require an enormous tension temporarily exceeding the influx of energy, but they are experienced rather as pleasant, for example, gymnastic exercises, while insignificant work can be unpleasant only due to the fact that insignificant result is achieved by relatively high expenditure of energy. It is necessary, as if to recognize the relation between the spent energy and the achieved effect. Undoubtedly, at the higher stages of development, in man, for example, it is quite possible to judge about disproportionality of the results to the means, but it is hardly necessary to accept in the field of direct effective adaptation to estimate any other relation than the relation of expenditure of energy to its restorations. In fact, it is enough to reduce the work of the organism and of the individual organs to the work of their elements, in order to be convinced that this estimate alone is sufficient to guide the organism in the economization of forces. The organ itself is the product of adaptation. It is such and not different, precisely because, under the given conditions, this particular structure is most expedient. This structure ultimately consists of elements, pairs of cells, each bearing a certain work, and able to restore itself by nutrition. In order for the organ not to break down, there must be equal forces. Suppose that 100 people lift a weight. If they pull rhythmically and at once, all the great work can be done with pleasure. But suppose that these people pull apart, in groups of 90 people, 9 people, and one more person pulling alone. 90 people will not feel much difference. 9 people will grumble about the impossible weight, and the straggler, without giving almost any assistance to his comrades, will probably die of exhaustion. The most economical work requires its uniformity and proper distribution. In a word, organization of work. But the body is a working organization of elements. When it is forced by circumstances to work disorganized, it does not work economically. Economical work for it is that in which it works according to the conditions of its organization. The organ may be far from being exhausted by a negligible work, but if this work is wrong, some of its elements will be exhausted. These elements will be subjected to the vitality of overconsumption, which will cause pain as a warning signal. This explains, in our opinion, the fact that not only the recovery of the overconsumption of energy and the luxurious discharge of its excess, but also its correct, regular, economical expenditure cause positive affect, and that negative affect accompanies not only the general overconsumption of energy and the excess of spare, unorganized material, but also the inexpedient in terms of the principle of the least expenditure of energy. We have yet to establish, with all possible brevity, some biomechanical and psychological premises. We apologize to the reader for the somewhat dryness of these preliminary considerations, but they are the foundations absolutely necessary for positive aesthetics, since aesthetics is the science of evaluation, and, in part, of the creative activity arising from evaluation. It is clear, then, that aesthetics turns out to be one of the most important branches of biology as a science of life in general. We are inclined to think that not only aesthetics, but all psychology and even sociology must be regarded as part of the science of life, and will sooner or later be seen in terms of the basic laws of biomechanics, of which we have given a brief sketch here. The organism has to struggle in a very real way with the particular influences of the environment. In doing so, however, the psyche does not develop by synthesis and generalization, but by a purely analytical route. Indeed, the psyche originally consisted, apparently, in a dualistic relation of the organism to the elements of the external environment. Contact with some of them was accompanied by positive affect, with others by negative, and the organism rushed either toward the source of its influence or in the opposite direction. This dualism runs a red thread from the simplest protozoa to the highest types of cultural humanity. It serves as the basis for evaluating the world and the source of notions of good and evil. The further development of the psyche was reduced to the gradual isolation next to the sensation emotions, pain and pleasure, of pure sensations. Tactile, gustatory, thermal, olfactory, auditory, visual, innervational. The affects still pointed to the general character of the reaction, the character of approaching and removing, but the reactions have become infinitely more complex and have broken up into a vast mass of varieties and combinations. We cannot enter into a detailed consideration of the evolution of the psyche, whose theory is still full of hypotheses and obscurities. We pass to man, and find in him the same typical features. He maintains his life by means of a vast and complex series of reactions to external phenomena, his feelings guiding him in doing so. The most powerful adaptation is, of course, the ability to immediately determine which reaction should be opposed to a given objective phenomenon. If the phenomenon is very common, the process is very short. The organism reacts to it almost unconsciously. But if it is new and unusual, the organism seeks reaction. Images of previous experiences appear, and from them, a new reaction is produced plastically. Processes of remembering, recognition, etc. are accompanied by expenditure of neuromuscular substance. Brain is the organ of memory, an organ of production of new reactions by combination of old ones. In view of the enormous diversity of the environment influencing the human being, the classification of phenomena must acquire great importance in the life of the human psyche. The various phenomena must, if possible, be brought under general types. That is, they must be combined in the human mind with a single reaction. But at the same time, it is extremely important to distinguish deviations from the general type of a given series of phenomena in order to vary reactions accordingly. Under the pressure of these needs, and according to the law of the least expenditure of effort, there was a growth of technique, a development of words, of grammar, of logic. All this was originally done semi-consciously, accumulated by itself. Only specific life difficulties were resolved. But experience was accumulated through memory and gradually organized. That is, everything obviously contradicting the facts should gradually fall away on its own. The brain appeared and developed like any other organ. Its expediency is a natural product of struggle for existence, direct adaptation to environmental influences and selection. Through the mediation of the brain, the work done by all the organs of the body is evaluated and regulated. But, in addition, the brain is also capable of evaluating the work that is done directly by itself, i.e., of suffering from its excessive or incorrect nature and enjoying the correct expenditure of the accumulated energy. The brain is also regenerated by nourishment. Idleness is also harmful to it. A rapid expenditure of stored energy is also useful, as long as this expenditure is not excessive. It also feels whether the work is properly distributed among its elements or not. In short, the brain is subject to all biomechanical laws. If pleasure is felt in the expedient movements of the hand, measured and strong, because the hand is the result of adaptation, then pleasure is also felt when thought develops vigorously, without delay, without contradiction. The brain accumulates experience. The brain combines the present with the past and regulates reactions. It rises above the moment. It retains traces of the past. It has a vision of the future. This past and future consist of pale images, arising not in direct and simple, but in indirect and complex dependence on the external environment. Gradually, the individual signs of specific memories are erased. Only a general concept remains, which is connected to a certain sign or word. When no work is presented to the brain by the external environment, and the reserve of energy exists in it, the brain plays. It, freely obeying only its organization, functions. It plays with images, combining them, or creates. It plays with concepts, combining them, thinks.